So, on behalf of all my colleagues here at the Centre, I'm really delighted to welcome you to our two-day conference. We're going to be thinking about photography and Britishness. And I just wanted to reflect for a moment on that title, why this particular topic, and why put these two words together. Well, we didn't want to make a conference about photography in Britain or British photography because we felt that those phrases are to some degree already closed, and they suggest a history of a subject as though it's already predetermined what that subject is. And that's really the opposite of what we wanted to do here. Putting photography together with Britishness seemed to offer a methodology for a more open-ended inquiry, because this word Britishness is quite a speculative term. It suggests a quality or an experience, but what exactly that constitutes is very much up for question. And of course, that is what we want to talk about today in relation to photography. We've been using this image by Martin Parr as a kind of a reference point for our conference, not because we want to make it an exemplary of our topic, but because it points to the kinds of tension that we want to explore. This image and the larger body of work that it's part of has very often been characterized as capturing an essence of Britishness. But of course, that essence isn't just sitting out there waiting to be captured. Martin Parr's photography has defined those ideas of Britishness and British essence for us. So this two-way pull is something we want to address here, how photography is seen to capture images of Britishness and how our sense of what Britishness constitutes is produced by the photographic image. And I think we had a good sentence in our call for papers that's been kind of our leitmotif in thinking about this, and that's whether Britishness can have a photographic referent or whether it is itself an effect of representation. So we may or may not answer those questions today and tomorrow, but I am glad that we are talking about them. We received more than 130 responses to our call for proposals and many very excellent and diverse proposals, and it was truly hard to narrow our selection down to our 15 speakers that we have here, and we're really thankful to all of those who took an interest. There was huge variation in how the juxtaposition of these two words was interpreted or how people tried to make sense of them, and also the kinds of materials that people wanted to bring into the inquiry. But what did seem clear is that the juxtaposition has a value, and not least by making visible or making us think about some of the mechanisms and assumptions that often remain deeply obscured in a world of images, even in plain sight. In between posting our call for papers and selecting the proposals, Brexit happened, and I think that's as clear a signal as any that Britishness continues to represent a highly unstable and unsettled category. So before we get things underway, I just want to say a few words of acknowledgement and thanks. And first of all, to highlight that this conference is the result of a three-way collaboration between Yale Centre for British Art, the Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art in London, and the Huntington Library Art Collections and Botanical Gardens in San Marino. And although our three institutions operate in very different ways, we have obviously a shared mission in that we support research. We are each fellowship-granting institutions, and we have a converging set of interests and major holdings that focus specifically on British art, and that's what our collaboration seeks to build on. This is the second conference that our three institutions have developed as a joint effort. Last December, it was my great pleasure to work with Stephen Hindle, the Director of Research at the Huntington, and Mark Hallett, the Director of Studies at the Mellon Centre, on a conference about British portraiture, a subject very much of interest to our three institutions. And I want to thank Mark Hallett and Steve Hindle, and also Amy Myers, the Director of the Centre, for their interest and enthusiasm for continuing this collaboration, this partnership. For all of our three institutions, the opportunity to focus on photography is very pertinent and timely. I think the Centre isn't always associated with photography, but it's an area we're actively developing across collections, exhibitions, and research. We've made some major acquisitions and received important gifts that have expanded our holdings, and we have significant amounts of photographic materials that perhaps are less well known because they sit in our rare books and manuscript department, and take the form of things like family albums, personal collections, carte de visite, collections of stereographic photographs, and things like that. Some of you will have a chance to see selections from our collections and also the collections at Yale during the breakout sessions. For those of you that weren't able to sign up for breakout sessions because our numbers were limited, we do have material on display in the galleries on the second floor, and I want to point out in particular that we have a loan currently of 5 really fantastic classic Martin Parr photographs from the last resort and Think of England on display on the second floor. And thanks to Martin and Janet Borden for allowing us to have those loans. So please use the breaks to wander around. So that's the center. At the Huntington, the photographic holdings are perhaps more generally associated with American photography, but what's less well known is that the Huntington does have major British holdings, which are particularly notable in the photographically illustrated books that Henry Huntington acquired, often en bloc, through his purchases of libraries. And more recently, in 2006, the acquisition of the Burnley Library of the History of Science and Technology, and of the some 67,000 volumes and manuscripts, there's around 20% of material that's pertaining to Britain and the British Empire. At the Paul Mellon Center, as well as a teaching and research focus on photography, there are efforts underway to develop strong resources for the study of photography across acquisitions of books, journals, and archives. And another thing that's perhaps not very well known is that the Paul Mellon Center and the Yale Center for British Art both have large photographic archives that record works of art made in Britain between 1500 and 1945. And we have some 200,000 of those images, and we're in the process of devising strategies for digitizing those collections. Colleagues from our 3 institutions put this conference together. At the Paul Mellon Center, Sarah Turner, the Deputy Director for Research, worked with me on the first draft of the call for papers. John Tagg, who is actually at Binghamton, Distinguished Professor of Art History, but currently here at Yale as our Andrew Carnduff-Ritchie Visiting Scholar, helped refine that call. And Jennifer Watts, Curator of Photography at the Huntington, and Chitra Ramalingam, Lecturer in History at Yale and Research Associate here at the Center, helped with the selection of papers and shaping the program. And some of us are offering breakout sessions, and all 5 of us will be chairing the sessions over the 2 days. And of course, John will shortly kick us off with an introduction. Before I hand over to John, I just want to mention that this conference is being recorded. The content will be made available online in our journal. Here's issue 3, British Art Studies, a relatively new journal that we launched a year ago. It's published jointly by the Paul Mellon Center and the Yale Center for British Art, and is free and open access. Sarah Turner and I are the editors of the journal, and we're weaving elements from this conference into our issue 4, which comes out later this month. And we're very thankful to John Tagg for leading a so-called conversation piece titled Exit Theory, Thinking Photography and Thinking History from One Crisis to Another. And many, many contributors and respondents are involved in that. And I also want to thank Martin Parr, whose images will feature as our cover collaboration and will reflect, as he will talk about later today in the keynote, his 40 years of photographing the people and places of Britain. And of course, I want to thank all our speakers for agreeing to make their talks and papers available in the form of recorded content. And we're really excited about being able to make this connection between our conference, our research activities, and having an output through the journal, so that when we close tomorrow at 5 and go our separate ways, there will be a continued dialogue, and we'll be able to share the work that we've done here more widely with the world. As you can imagine, a conference like this with our international cast of speakers and with so many wonderful and rich contributions from curators, students, and faculty here at Yale, it's taken a huge team effort. I'm really grateful to all my colleagues. And also, of course, sort of the back of house end, it's been a tremendous effort. And I do want to especially thank Sarah Krause, Jane Noah-Sadko, Arnold Bowles, who's up there, and Paul Harding for being so committed to coordinating this effort. Thank you all. I'm now really pleased to introduce John Tagg, who will get us going. As I mentioned, John Tagg is Distinguished Professor of Art History at Binghamton and he's currently here for the whole semester at Yale as our visiting scholar, and it's been a really great pleasure to have him amongst us and to work on projects together. I think I probably hardly need to tell this audience that John's work has been very much associated with forms of photographic practice, not necessarily obviously considered part of the history of photography, things like police and prison photography, surveillance, urban records, etc. And he's the author of the seminal and unforgettable book, The Burden of Representation, which was published in 1988. And I won't go on to list the many books and essays that he has published since then. While here at Yale, he's working on, amongst other things, Walker Evans, and Evans will be the subject of his Andrew Conduff Ritchie lecture, which he will give here in this lecture hall on the 30th of November, so I hope many of you will be able to join us for that. But right now, he's going to introduce some of the premises and questions that this conference has attempted to grapple with. Please welcome John Tagg.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you to Sarah Turner and Jenny Watts, and indeed all the other tireless contributors to the organizing team. And many thanks, of course, to the Yale Center for British Art for the tremendous generosity of its support and hospitality that we're all enjoying. Well, how to begin with a topic that until recently perhaps might have seemed, at least in an academic context, rather outmoded, and in all events, best avoided. It does seem to invite us to some potentially deep waters, but that may be exactly where we need to begin. On the morning of Monday, April 22nd, 1912, the front page of London's Daily Mirror paid fulsome tribute to the grief of Mrs. Eleanor Smith, whose husband, the captain of the Titanic, had only a week before gone down with his ship, shouting, "Be British." Now, apocryphal as the story may have been, not least since the paper itself had already carried a report that the commander shot himself dead on the bridge of the doomed vessel. Nonetheless, the stirring last words attributed to Captain Smith rang true enough to find themselves, in due course, solemnly impressed into a commemorative tablet in Hanley Town Hall and cast in bronze on the plinth of Captain Smith's memorial statue in Lichfield's Beacon Park in Smith's native county of Staffordshire. So whether uttered or not, the words were compelling, if not for the crew, or indeed the American, Canadian, Chinese, Egyptian, French, German, Haitian, Hungarian, Irish, Lebanese, Syrian, and Swedish passengers who had been sailing under Captain Smith's care. If they weren't compelling for them, then perhaps more so for those back in Blighty to whose effective life they spoke. Now, of course, there is a history to this affect, hardly separable in the years leading up to the First World War from the market-driven manipulations of a newly founded and decidedly imperialist popular press, lavishly illustrated as it was with photographic half-tone plates. Yet, that is not to say that we can treat this affect as a fiction. The insistent repetition shows that words drained of content for us, perhaps, had at this moment an effective resonance, and not just that of a jingoistic appeal masquerading as lofty ideal in the face of a shaming national scandal. Self-serving the reported words may well have been, but in the quite literal sense of summoning a selfhood that even in extremis might keep the abyss of indifference at bay. Whether we imagine them ringing out over the North Atlantic or only over the breakfast table, the words were a call, and they called forth in turn a performative response. To be British was more than a designated status or even an imposed code. It was a set of internalized behaviors and a calling into place, not unlike our calling into place by the photograph, which also imposes its performative demands on our bodies, drawing us into the relations of identity and difference that are structural to the photograph's system of representation. But here I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's stay with the thought that, laugh as we may do now, in 1912, the injunction or command to be British carried vivid meaning and compelling consequences, at least for some. And yet, as Tom Nairn was to argue more than 6 decades later, the call that comes from the bridge is not like the call to other nationalisms. It's a calling into place where the place is troublingly uncertain. And this is not simply because the admonition, be British, is in actuality a convenient disguise for an English nationalism that cannot speak its name. That may be part of the displacement in play around the signifier British. But this displacement, Nairn insists, is rooted in a history more complicated than that of simple English usurpation. As Nairn points out, Britain has never been a federal state, and the theory of the British polity has always held the sovereignty of the Queen and Parliament to be total. Yet historically, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland has remained a multinational union, divided but not threatened by differences of language, culture, patterns of life, and even patriotic affiliation. This rather odd accommodation, and the space it creates for ambiguity and evasion, is rooted in the history of the state's formation. Unlike other modern constitutional states, the British, or perhaps one should say the Anglo-British state, was not born of concerted insurrection and invention, but rather grew slowly and idiosyncratically, as, in Nairn's words, the midwife of modern constitutionalism that never became modern itself. What saved it, or alternatively held it back, were its early, perhaps premature revolution and the subsequent conquest of its maritime ascendancy, splendidly on show in the third-floor galleries above us now. Sustained by the inheritance of its external triumphs, as well as by its concomitant control of the world's money market, the patrician Anglo-British state persisted in all of its backwardness, assimilating surrounding nationalities to its seeming success. As a result, there was to be no second modernizing revolution, either of its constitution or of its half-formed state. Now, this had distinct consequences for the projection of British nationalism. In the absence of any political mobilization of popular masses in support of state transformation or as a surrogate of sovereignty, what emerged was a politically inert nationalism that was complacent and deferent, severed from internal conflict and struggle, and rooted in a carefully managed populism whose periodical mobilization for imperial expansion and war only further strengthened its inherent subservience and conservatism. A mythic Britishness was cast over the islands, calling on all the usual alibis of custom, geography, tradition, and continuity. But it remained aberrant among nationalisms in its divorce from any connection to the idea of the people, its function not being to propel social transformation, but rather to hold it back. Not a lever for modernization then, but a bulwark against it. This is the thrust of Nairn's classic essay, The Twilight of the British State, written in 1976. And clearly, for Nairn, nationalisms are not fundamentally about identity, but arise from material conditions of uneven development and the constraints they impose. And yet, identities they do evoke and shape. Wedding populations in the United Kingdom, if not to the mobilizing myth of the agency of the people, then to their identification as subjects of a sovereignty on which the sun never sets. Now, of course, this interpolation has a specific history, which for Nairn, in his world system mode, places it in the context of global relations of uneven development as part of the appropriation by the core developed countries of a political mobilization born of necessity at the resourceless periphery. But just as the construction of Britishness involved more than the prolonging of certain idiosyncratic constitutional arrangements, the call of nationalism is more than just a materially determined idea. It turns on the mobilization of new rhetorics, methods of opinion management, and the co-option of popular cultural forms. And more than this, it requires a particular machinery, not just an idea and a theoretical framework, but mechanisms, material, means, and institutions, systems of cultural production, methods of training and modes of address, a whole network of apparatuses, of which, remember, the museum was also an early and central product, and into which then the new technologies of communication and knowledge production would soon be incorporated. So we return to the photographic assemblage, not just the camera as an instrument of identification and separation, but also the systems of storage and retrieval to which the camera was always attached, systems which have their own history of technical invention and which would become the archival technology of imperial knowledge. And no more is this assemblage solely defined by the photographically registered image. For photography in the 19th century was not a discrete medium in this sense. Driven by the demands of commerce and consumption, it traded readily and extensively with a proliferating range of printing techniques that fueled an unprecedented outpouring of printed information. This gave the photographically derived image in print an extraordinary reach, shaping it as a prime vehicle not just for the generation of profits, but for propagating civic virtues and constructing those collective imaginaries that work to cohere diverse and divided populations. As Geoffrey Batchen has recently written, the sharing of printed images gathered from all over the world allowed the British Empire to maintain a sense of its coherence as an apparently benign yet all-seeing, all-powerful colonial enterprise. The dissemination of photographic images also permitted certain key differences important to that enterprise to be reiterated and made visible. So perhaps now our conference title is beginning to look a little different. What seems to present the familiar conjunction of two solid and stable realities, inviting consideration of the myriad cultural expressions of national character, can now be read, and not just metaphorically, as staging the confrontation of two great inventions of the 19th century, Britishness and photography. Two extended, hybrid, networked machines, or as Foucault would say, dispositifs. Where this then directs our attention is not towards the reflection of a given identity through a cultural medium, the expression and inflection of some national sensibility, or the picturing of the archetypes of national identity, but rather towards the cogs and chains, the levers and bolts, by which these two great steam age machines of capture were coupled together to produce their effects. Whether or not sparks flew and the gears ground, because neither ran smoothly, however well-oiled and greased, and however hard the engineers of meaning and identification worked at it. So it's at the many convergent and divergent histories of this coupling and uncoupling that we will look today and tomorrow. From inside and from outside, the imaginary of British self-identity, right from the age of empire to the complexities of the post-imperial era that we have labeled post-Britishness. And I do want to say, echoing Martina in closing, that having sent out the call for papers, we were admittedly surprised and certainly greatly heartened by the scope of the response. Perhaps indeed it had something to do with a certain plebiscite that made our theme suddenly seem prescient and timely. But be that as it may, I would also like to thank all of the scholars and photographers who responded to the call in numbers far greater than we could accommodate here. And I particularly want to thank, too, those who've traveled to be with us to share their images and insights. So now, I guess, the time has come for us to put on our overalls, pick up our tool bags, and get to grip with these two steam-age machines. So I do look forward to seeing the hammers fall and the anvils tremble. Welcome to our conference. Thank you.